Hi, shalom friends. You know, there are many slogans and statements that we make, even without thinking. Like, wait a minute, I'll be with you. Of course, no one looks at the clock or to see if it's 60 seconds or not. But there's one particular expression which I personally find, I don't know, the word's not offensive. I just find it abrasive. And that's the word, no problem. So basically, you're working in the office, and for some reason or other, your copy machine is not functioning. So you go to across the cubicle. You say, "Hey Bob, can I borrow the copy machine just for a couple of moments?" And Bob barely even looks up, says, "No, not right now. Now's not a good time." And you say, "Oh, no problem," as if nothing happened. Of course, nothing actually happened, but what are you really thinking? Perhaps one of the thoughts you're thinking is, why did he say no? It's no sweat off his back. Well, let's say you're making a party, and you're going to be having a lot of guests, and you're on speaking civil terms with your neighbor, so you figure he won't mind. You go over, you knock on the door, you say, "I'm having a party tonight. It's going to start at 7. I know you come home at 6, and you hardly ever use the driveway. Can I park over there? And if you need it, just knock on my door. It's no problem." And he says, "Oh, well, you never know. I'd rather leave it open." And you say, "Oh, no problem." And what are you thinking? You're thinking, why did he say no? Okay, question to you. No problem means no problem, or no problem means that there is a problem, but I won't pay attention to the problem? Or to put it slightly different, how do you know when it's no problem? And let me substitute the word problem for the word forgiveness. How do you know the word "I forgive you," or "it's meaningless," or "it didn't bother me"? How do you know when that's really true? Rashi, a foremost biblical commentator, gives us a remarkable insight into this dilemma or this question. And the Torah in the book of Leviticus says, do not take revenge. And it says, do not harbor a grudge. Now, many people in their own mind have a definition of what is a grudge. But Rashi actually explains to us what does it mean not to harbor a grudge, and what's the difference between a grudge and taking revenge. He says the following. And I'm making up the example. Let's say neighbor number 1 needs to borrow a cow. So he goes to neighbor number 2 and he says, "Can I borrow your cow?" Neighbor number 2 says no, without giving a reason. The answer is no, flatly no. Neighbor 1 goes back home. 2 weeks later, neighbor number 2 comes back to neighbor number 1 and says, "You know what, I have to borrow a cow." And neighbor number 1 says, "I'm not going to lend it to you. You didn't lend it to me." Says Rashi, that's taking revenge. But what happens if it's exactly the same case? Neighbor number 1 says, "Can I borrow your cow?" Neighbor number 2 says no. 2 weeks later, number 2 comes to number 1 and says, "Can I borrow your cow?" And neighbor number 1 says, "Absolutely. I'm not like you. You said no to me, but I'm not saying no to you." Now, I would think that guy should get credit for overlooking that insult. But says Rashi, he actually is harboring a grudge. Because if he didn't harbor a grudge, he wouldn't have said it. So we have this beautiful insight from Rashi. How do you know when it's no problem? When your friend across the cubicle or your neighbor needs you or requests of you, and you respond with a feeling of, sure, why not? If you don't have that feeling, sure, why not? Even if you're giving it, here's the word, listen, grudgingly, which means you're harboring a grudge. Hasidic storytelling is so beautiful. Let me share with you a true story that happened with one of the great Rebbes of the Hasidic movement. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak Meir. He was the first Rebbe of Gur. He was a remarkable Talmud Chacham, Torah scholar, extraordinary actually, and an extraordinary saintly person. And he spent his entire day either praying, studying, or teaching. but because of his deep devotion to his fellow Jew, he would actually sacrifice a certain amount of time a day where people could ask him advice and ask him for his blessings. Obviously, it was a narrow window, and there were always many people waiting in turn. Well, how do you keep a system and an order? So he had a devoted, middle-aged chassid whose name was Rabbunim, who was in charge of sort of keeping the order. Even when people stood in line, there were always exceptions to the rule, sometimes a venerable chassid, sometimes an emergency, and then everyone was politely asked to let the other person go first. And of course, everyone knew Rabbunim, this middle-aged shamish of the Rebbe, was a very dedicated and committed person, didn't play favorites, and they respected him immensely. Whatever he asked, they did. One day there was a youngish fellow, maybe 30, who was very agitated, and he had come from a faraway place, and he was waiting in line, and it happened to be that that day there was some type of an emergency, and someone had to precede the line. So Rabbunim asked the people, can you please go back? This person is next in line. And everyone followed except for this youngish man. Rabbunim said, Rabbi, please, there's someone that has to go see the Rebbe. And this guy was maybe in a bad mood, maybe he was just too filled with anxiety, maybe he was just not in the right mind. But he said to Rabbunim, no, I don't want to move. I have a very important thing to ask the Rebbe. So Rabbunim, in a very gentle way, really gentle, he said, please, go back a little bit and put his hand on the man's chest. Didn't push him really. It was more of pressure, as if to say, please. But this youngish man did something completely uncharacteristic. He got angry. And he got so angry, he slapped this middle-aged man and said, you're not going to tell me what to do? And there was a collective gasp. I mean, how does a person hit someone in front of a Rebbe? And how does a younger man hit a middle-aged man? And it was like, and the fellow, realizing how impulsively he acted, was shocked. He was too embarrassed to say anything. He just walked out of line and went to the back. Rabbunim, though, his face was red with embarrassment. It had been the first time in his life that he was slapped. And between one gentleman entering the Rebbe's office before the next one came in, Rabbunim walked in, saw his master, and he just said the following, Rebbe, because I serve you sincerely, do I deserve a slap? He didn't say who slapped him. He just asked that rhetorically and walked out and felt a little bit better that he told the Rebbe. Anyway, the system worked until the fellow who was before in the back of the line, now there were people behind him, comes into the Rebbe, and he's ready to speak to the Rebbe. Rebbe, I have a terrible need. It's destroying my life and my wife's life. We're married over 7 years. We have no children, and our life is no life. So I come to the Rebbe to ask for his advice and blessing. And the Rebbe looked at him, and he said, I cannot bless you. The guy was taken aback. He said, how can I bless a Jew who lifts his hand against a fellow Jew? Now, how the Rebbe knew that is, I don't know the answer to that, other than he was a Rebbe. He saw and felt spiritual energies. And the man was crushed. He had traveled all of this distance. His last hope and only hope was that the Rebbe would somehow intercede for him in a divine way. And he blew it big time. And the Rebbe said, please leave. He walked outside. When he walked outside, on his face was written despair. Rabbunim, who had been slapped by this guy not that long ago, saw his face and ran over to him. Is everything okay? And with sobbing, he said, everything is not okay. I did what I did, and I am so sorry. But the Rebbe won't even look at me because of what I did. Rabbunim, who was a good-natured, holy Jew himself, said, what? We'll go in together. They both walk in, and Rabbunim says to the Rebbe, You don't want to help this man? And the Rebbe looked at Rabbunim, and he looked at the man, and he said, I cannot help this man because of what he did. So Rabbunim said, what does he have to do to get a blessing? He said, you have to first forgive him. Rabbunim looked at the man and said, Rabbi, I will forgive him, but only on one condition. And the man is thinking he's going to probably say, I have to pay him money, I have to do this or do that. He said, I'm willing to do whatever you say. That's what the man who slapped. And the Rebbe looks at Rabbunim and says, what is the condition? And with a smile he says, on the condition that the Rebbe not only promises but assures him of a child. The Rebbe, hearing that sincere, beautiful thought from a fellow Jew who loves a fellow Jew, gave the blessing happily. And this story was repeated. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story, because essentially, what does it mean to harbor a grudge? Harbor a grudge means, no problem, it's okay, but deep down, you're hurting, or you're judging, or a mixture of both. But Rabbunim, he did not harbor a grudge. He was humiliated, he was hurt, he was crushed. He felt it. And yet, the knowledge that this man needs a blessing desperately caused him that he wiped that away from his heart completely. It was truly no problem. On the contrary, I love you so much that I can't continue my life normally and with an equilibrium, knowing that you're suffering. Which leads me to one more Hasidic thought. How can God demand of us such a high level? I understand maybe that God could command us, I don't want you to take revenge. Revenge, says the Almighty, is mine. I'm a God of justice. I will make sure that whoever deserves what they will get what they get. You don't have to take revenge, I will. So do not take revenge. And besides, you give it up to man, who knows where it might lead. But how could God say, don't harbor a grudge? And for here we have to be reminded of a Hasidic teaching. And that is, nothing happens randomly. Nothing happens haphazardly. Anything that occurs to you is because God Almighty is orchestrating that event and wants you to experience that feeling. When you are uncomfortable about something, it's not your neighbor that made you feel uncomfortable. If you're feeling uncomfortable, it's because this is something that you're supposed to be feeling at this time. Perhaps it's a challenge for you, perhaps it's a test for you, perhaps it's only a temporary atonement for you, but you're supposed to be feeling uncomfortable. The fact that your neighbor was the cause of your discomfort is his responsibility. He has to say in his own way to God, if my neighbor is supposed to suffer with discomfort, let it not be through me. My job is to be a good neighbor. My job is to be a good person. My job is actually to love my fellow neighbor like myself. And I would want someone certainly to be considerate of my guests. I should do the same. So that's my responsibility. If I refuse my neighbor's simple request, can I park in your driveway? I won't disturb you. If you need it, all you have to do is tell me. Then I chose to do a sin, and I'm responsible for that. But my neighbor, he was supposed to feel that discomfort in any case. If it wouldn't be me refusing him, it might have been a garbage truck that was blocking the entrance, and he would have the same problem. He would have felt that in any case, that discomfort. You see, when you ask for a favor, and you asked in the first case I told you, from neighbor number A, can I borrow your cow? I need it to plow my field. And he said no. That means that your plow was not to be used that day, for whatever reason. either for a good reason, because God wanted to spare you working in the hot sun so you wouldn't get a heart attack, or for a reason that you don't deserve it. And it's an atonement. But if that was supposed to happen, not necessarily did it have to happen from your neighbor. Your neighbor could have done a commandment of loving you and allowing you to use the cow, and then something else might have happened that the plowing of that day would have been non-productive. In the meantime, your neighbor would have done a commandment of showing kindness and generosity. You would have been able to appreciate your neighbor as a real mensch, and God's plan would have unfolded in a different way. So you have to keep these two things in mind. What happens to you was supposed to happen to you. What the cause of what was supposed to happen to you doesn't necessarily have to come from man. It could come directly from God in manifold ways. So how can you avoid bearing a grudge? Whatever happens, you say, no problem. You know something? It was supposed to be. I wasn't supposed to use the copy machine. I wasn't supposed to borrow your car. You weren't supposed to help me. That's the fact. How do I know? It happened like that. And of course, this does not absolve the responsibility of your neighbor or fellow worker that he should always try to be the instrument of bringing blessing. But lo tikom, velo titor, do not take revenge, and especially do not harbor a grudge, is based primarily on the concept that there's no reason to harbor the grudge, because essentially that person did not do anything that you would not have experienced anyway. Well, it's a challenging, very, very challenging idea, but it's incredibly rewarding, because if you have firm belief and firm commitment that what happens to you is orchestrated from above, you will take things with a calmness of spirit, and you will be a much more accessible and a kind person to your fellow human being. Shalom.